Gardner Hospital. And we want to thank the 4 social workers. It was only with 4 people, an N of 4, in-depth interviews with 4 very experienced social workers who candidly shared their practice stories with us, and the head of the social work department, Mary Joyce, at Sir Charles Gardner Hospital, who made this all possible by her support. And we're going to get down to a raw interview of one particular person, a bit like Mario's story, and I want to start first with a much broader overview and the whole evidence-based practice zeitgeist that we're in, and the differing trajectories around evidence-based practice and its emergence in the 3 English-speaking countries that probably have most influence on how we practice what we practice. And so in the US, and it's lovely Barbara is here, and in the US, education is the big, you talked about public basis for this. Driving it is really big public enterprises need to be able to plan and structure and, be accountable for how they spend public purse. In the US, it's education that was the big original driver, and a man called Campbell, after the war, Second World War, derived a lot of research designs that let you measure kids in classrooms and come up with evidence about what kids and education were about. And this was incredibly powerful, even though Campbell himself is sometimes horrified at what has happened to his original ideas, where they've ended up. And of course, in America, it ended up in the No Child Left Behind debacle. Has everyone heard about the No Child Left Behind? And this idea that with the right facts, the right scientific evidence, we'd be able to teach every child in America to read. And that was one of George Bush's legacies, which hasn't delivered what was hoped. Now, in the UK, in contrast, it's been medicine, and of course the UK has a National Health Service, which America doesn't have, and that probably explains why the different focus. But in America, Steve Cochrane, doctor, did a report. He presented it in New Zealand, of all places, but it went on to have this incredible influence around the world. And of course we now have the Cochrane Library, and it's been incredibly influential, systematic reviews, really central to the whole evidence-based practice movement. In the UK, I'll go into this a bit more, but in the UK, this had a big influence in the child protection field, which I know something about. I don't know that much about mental health per se, but child protection. And I was in Finland a few years ago, and an UK academic presented about the new system of how they log child protection reports. And it was all to be done on computer with a template. And no narratives were allowed. People went to training on how to put no narrative in their child protection report. And he was describing people getting scraps of paper and bits of sticky tape and putting it onto the form, and it being cleared off because there were to be no narratives. It all had to fit the template. And I'll talk some more a bit later, but Eileen Munro has been appointed by the present British government to reform child protection in the UK, and they have done away with that pre-formatted template, and they've really strongly brought back the idea of professional judgment of the social worker. So that's the UK and the US, and I want to just finish about my experience of social work. And after I'd worked in the Kimberleys here in Australia, I went off to America to do my PhD with Norm Denson in Illinois. And my very first conference I ever went to in America was at Atlanta, Georgia, and a man called Joel Fisher. This is in 1992. Joel Fisher was the keynote speaker, and he was passionate about the coming scientific revolution in social work, where instead of just fluffing around like they did, social workers would actually use scientific evidence in their everyday practice and refer to scientific articles before they took action. Only a man could come up with this idea, I think. But what is interesting to think about is there was a book at the time by, oh gosh, I've forgotten, he starts with a K, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn, who was a historian of scientific knowledge and its development across time. And so while Joel Fisher sounded terribly scientific, it was just an idea he picked up that was in the general discourse that he managed to turn into a very attractive proposition that was very influential. That's 1992. In those days we didn't talk about evidence-based practice, but it was already in the air that we should get more scientific and social work. And Eileen Gambrell, you talked about Eileen Gambrell from California. I think she's one of the best writers on evidence-based practice, and she uses the term, I don't know, I think evidence-informed practice I'd prefer, but and sometimes I think, well, she's really put all this work in because she's met some real airheads of social workers who need to have this idea brought in. And she's a long-standing supporter and promoter of evidence-based practice in the US, and she describes it as the integration of best research evidence with clinical expertise and client values. She's a long way ahead of where Joel Fisher was, and she sees evidence-based practice as being created as a response to professionals not acting on research findings, not being accountable, not being able to hold their own. And I think that remains a really key issue for us as a discipline, that we need to, like you said about your doctor friend, you're joking, aren't you? Because happy you got one. But tensions, lots of tensions around what constitutes evidence-based practice. You like that, don't you? The little cartoon, more Dr. Smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. So I think we beat ourselves up a lot as not being perfect, but other disciplines all have a range of possibilities within them. But in the UK, Carolyn Taylor and Susan White have done a lot of work in this area. And, of course, they acknowledge the value of evidence to social work, health and welfare, but they also challenge some ideas and assumptions which underpin evidence-based practice. And, you know, as evidenced in the work of Joel Fisher, the quest for certainty and the assumptions of the existence of certainty. And, you know, going back to Joel Fisher, I came to America from working in the Kimberleys. I was absolutely gobsmacked to find that social work in Illinois, when you met a client, you very quickly had to decide what category from the DSM-4 you were going to use, because you couldn't put a bill for payment unless you had a category. And the categories were preset. I just couldn't imagine using it with people I work with in the Kimberley. I'm sure we'll get there in the end, but at that time it was... But when I looked a bit more, the School of Social Work was about to be closed down. The only people lobbying to have it saved were, can anyone guess?
Clients.
No.
Doctors.
No. Insurance companies, because social workers delivered the cheapest service to their clients, and they were mainly mental health.
Well, that's the public sector needs to recognise that, and we will then, you know, burgeon in terms of our professional status, that we're cheap and...
Well, there is some research to say we're more effective too in the American setting. Barbara probably knows some of that. Yeah, and for all the reasons that you described, that often people, yeah, work better with a social worker than some of the other. Cheerful and cheap, that's us. But in all of this quest for certainty and the assumption of the existence of certainty. And in fact, there is no certainty, and everybody knows that. We're actually the profession that mops up some of that and lets other people get on. That's what I say about Joel Fisher being a male. Only a male could be so certain, because you've got someone else to mop up and do the housework. But I'm very old. Anyway, on to the next point.
I haven't abused anyone in years.
But do you mop up and do all the housework?
Are you saying you're about to? I've been thinking about it.
And in this quest for certainty and the existence of certainty, there's this implicit proposal that there is but one form of rationality, and that form can be obtained through the use of the scientific method, which will generate facts, and that is knowledge, and the only knowledge that counts. There was a famous man in social work, American social work, but they had endless papers, you know, debating this issue. Walter Hudson, very firmly stated, if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. And there was a really very big group in the American setting that took that view very strongly and wanted to push social work very much in that direction.
But, and that was also part of the broader context of empirical research across the whole of the American social and scientific disciplines. Yes. That it was only empirical evidence that mattered and counted the empirical.
Exactly, and and it still exists.
That's right.
And of course, the word empirical actually comes from the era when people used to sit in armchairs and just theorise in the abstract. So empirical actually means in its root origins from experience. That you actually went out and touched something. But now it sort of means the opposite of experiential. So it's interesting when you think about language. And I think that's the important point I want to stress, the language. And you made the point when you said about all those words for refugee, they won't mean much. But language is constitutive of outcome, and that's shaping our practice very much. But we do have to know about it, and if we're going to be a private practitioner, we have to be able to use that language to connect to the system. But what Taylor and White are really reminding us that in social work, there's a moral, practical, political dimension to our work that becomes muted when we just think about the technical rational as if that's the only knowledge that counts. And certainly in the American setting, you can see that the focus on the individual and measuring them in their various ways dilutes any focus on the social and looking at the broader social framing of what is going on with people. And they argue the importance of subjective reflexive perspectives in order to recognise and value these moral, practical and political. Subjective reflexive ties into reflective, but it is also tied into, you're talking about social workers being context specialists, and what that system of child protection in the UK did was strip context from any report. And when you do that, that's why they closed it down. It just doesn't work anymore. You just cannot be an effective practitioner if you strip context. So Stephen Webb's questioning validity of evidence-based practice. Stephen Webb is now an Australian academic. He's the only social work academic appointed to the Excellence in Research panel of specialists, which decides the quality of all Australian research. He's at the University of Newcastle. And in a very important article in 2001, he questioned the validity of the whole idea of evidence-based practice. It presumes a particularly deterministic version of rationality, which is not what happens in practice. It suggests that complex phenomena, such as decision-making, are not rationally determined nor subject to control. You've all made decisions that are difficult to make. You don't make them just technically or with an absolute outcome assured. And separating dynamic processes that we work with into facts and values undermines professional judgment and discretion in social work. Overall, he felt evidence-based practice, and he's particularly talking about the UK experience, is an unhelpful blend of scientism. Scientism is a word that just means the only knowledge that counts is that obtained through the scientific method. An unhelpful blend of scientism and managerialism, and it is for the top-down control issues purposes rather than making sure effective social work is going to be happening. So just a quick look at Eileen Munro's work and the introduction of professional judgment. And Google her. People were talking about access to databases, but there's so much available on Google these days. It's amazing. She makes the points: audit and inspection systems fail to make practice transparent. We forget what's actually happening in practice when we fill out endless forms as an accounting of what we do. The mistaken emphasis on easily measured, such as forms filled and meetings held, means that the most important aspects of child protection work just don't get accounted for anywhere. Evidence-based practice undermines professional practice while legitimating a harsh managerialist ethos. And what Eileen Munro stresses, and I think this again resonates with your work, Jim, the importance of regular critical supervision in social work, that you cannot have professional judgment if that's not happening, if you're just working as a sole operator. Now, going back to America, Jane Gilgan has tangled away at this whole idea of evidence-based practice and come up with 4 cornerstones to effective social work. Research and theory is important. Practice wisdom, what we learn from practice, and we just had a presentation from Colleen on that. And the actual person, the embodied self of the practitioner, how we enact and how we relate in practice, and what clients bring to the practice situation. Importantly, she views evidence as always provisional, meaning understandings are open to modification as new evidence unfolds. And falsification is crucial, meaning there's a willingness to seek information that challenges our own understandings and an openness to contradictory evidence. And that's about being scientific, and that's just the long-standing value of science. So, to our research, overview of our research was a WA study, how skilled hospital social workers draw on multiple forms of knowledge for effective practice. And we talked with 4 experienced hospital social workers, and we also reviewed health records for social work entries. And that was to look at how did they account for their practice in the records that were kept compared to how they talked about their practice when we did an in-depth interview. And there was a significant difference, as you can imagine. It was a qualitative design, in-depth interviews. They talked about what knowledge they use in their practice, and they were asked about any advice they had for new social workers. And we had to get permission from 2 ethics committees, which was quite difficult, but it did force us to be really clear about our design and what we were doing, because we had to explain ourselves up front. And the knowledge we gained is knowledge that probably all of you have some contact with, but we very rarely actually collect it and write it up as an article. And it's Dorothy Smith, the famous Canadian sociologist, talks about texts that leave no trace. We have lots of texts every day in what we do in interacting with people, and we're highly skilled at it, but we don't actually track it. And in terms of evidence, if you have no track, well, it doesn't exist. So maybe because it's about what we do, we don't think it's worthy of research. It doesn't constitute real research. And so we want to suggest that practice-based research is real research, and we should be doing more of it. So we have published 1 paper from this work, and it's called The Interplay of Evidence and Knowledge for Social Work Practice in a Health Setting, and it was published in 2009. And I'll just give you that. If you can access it, you can have a look at it. You'll see what the end product is. What I want to present here is some of the raw material from which we get to an end product. That article is about a different story to the one I'm presenting today, but the key points that emerged in that article were that there are a lot of divergent views, that there are both empirical in the sense you talked about, Trudy, meaning from the scientific method, and reflective approaches as to what constitutes evidence. Australian social workers are required to articulate forms of evidence shaping their practice. There is no getting away from that. There is no going back to an earlier time when maybe we weren't. We really are required. Even if you're in private practice, you've got to do an accounting of what it is you're doing. In our study with health social workers, they drew on both empirical and reflective traditions in and for practice, and that they were active agents in making knowledge in situ as well as applying knowledge. They were knowledge makers as they went. Now, evidencing through narrative. Narrative is a word that gets used, and I was fascinated to hear that you can do it with Indigenous clients and no one else, apparently, in the private health system. But when I went to my study in America, There's a lot of talk about the interpretive turn, the narrative turn in social theory, which is against the empirical movement. So the two are in constant tension. And I think in social work we have to work with both, because we'd be crippling ourselves if we wanted to deny the narrative interpretive turn, but we have to realise the other is the dominant one and we have to be able to talk with it. So in all our interviews the word narrative was not used, but it's what emerged across them all. Feature of narrative is their sequence and consequence. Events are selected, they're organised, they're connected, and they're evaluated as meaningful for a particular audience. That's taken from Kathy Reisman's work. We work with stories in social work. We do it every day. We often don't think we're doing narrative, but we are, and we have to turn that narrative into what Colleen was talking about. Keep going for that orange. Into the language that counts in those that can pay for our services, the funding. Narrative is retrospective meaning making. It focuses on the particular. It's socially situated ways of knowing and making sense of the world. And we come back to that, context specialists. That's what we're doing. Focused on a very particular site and setting. Narratives are not just personal stories of one practitioner. They can also affect social change. These stories together can affect how social work is practiced in healthcare and also how it is seen and valued by others in the system. Narratives can make the invisible visible. Now, I know I just mentioned some gender stuff, but I lived through the time when feminism emerged out of nowhere. And those narratives, those stories people told is what, that social movement happened. There are evidence-based practice is another social movement, that narratives were told about useless social workers that couldn't even articulate why they did what they did, and it got enough momentum to be important and be acted on. I'm going to jump that because I want to get to Elizabeth's story, a case study of effective social work. This is the interviewee. I'm thinking of Elizabeth de Cruz. Elizabeth was a young woman who had throat cancer and was only in her early 20s with a partner and a fairly difficult family, an extended family around her. Particularly, her parents were quite strict and from a different culture and had definite views. And the reason it was a highly emotive situation, because there was a young child involved. I know I was effective. The bit about that I know. I was effective. It was a long-term case, so I got a chance to know everybody, which is quite different from the way we usually work, and we had a lot of contact with her and her family. The reason I know I was effective was because it was a very emotive case, and amongst the staff group, I became the person who was sought out by members of staff, kind of unofficially became the spokesperson, even to the point where the consultant asked me at what point we should tell Elizabeth that she was dying. So even these medical decisions became psychosocial in a sense. It was a family where the issues were highly emotive and also a little bit unpleasant. There were unpleasant aspects to the case in that people reacted strongly to Elizabeth's father in quite a negative way, and he wanted custody of Elizabeth's child when she died, and Elizabeth didn't want that. And because Elizabeth was about the same age as quite a few of the nurses on the ward, there were unofficial friendships forming, and people were quite strong in their opinions. There was a loss of objectivity. Angela Fielding did this interview. She asks, "It must have touched a lot of them very personally." It did. She did. I tried very hard to stay neutral because I guess I understood that if I was to be effective, I needed to be neutral so that all members of this family were able to connect with me. It's easy to react to other people's reactions, but that really wasn't my role. And I guess because of my social work training, I was aware that it was not my position to judge. And I didn't know enough about other people's histories to make those choices or decisions. And it was not my place. I was quite clear about that. And even if I did, it would probably only make me feel better And in the end, it wouldn't actually make me feel better because I wouldn't be achieving anything for my client, who was Elizabeth. So you were positioning yourself in the role that you took. How do you see that makes you think it was effective? Because even the parents who were feeling very stigmatised by the ward, and even to the extent where they felt they couldn't approach certain members of the nursing staff because they felt they'd made a decision about whether they were good or bad parents, they were aware of how they were being judged. These parents would still come and talk to me. And there were various members of the extended family who had different positions. And we did hold a family meeting where everybody was present. We managed to convey the same message and talk about the best wishes of Elizabeth's child. We recorded the meeting. We had a tape recorder present because I knew that it was a difficult subject. We did tape recording, which was then transcribed and sent to each member. It was a fairly unusual move, but because of the circumstances surrounding the case and because it might become a legal issue in the future, I felt that it was warranted, and it did calm people down. I think it was a transparent process too, because I was very clear about the reason for doing it. Each person got a copy of that transcript. They were able to disagree or agree, writing back with their amendments to the transcript. Nothing would be altered. That was how I, or otherwise it would have gone on forever. So I guess I set some very clear ground rules. It worked. My brother's a lawyer and he's made me very cautious, but I find that with family meetings, where there's a potential difficulty you know about, it's all in how you set the meeting out, and the staff were very thankful for my lead in how we should go ahead. Angela. So really, as you say, you took a lead role in managing that very difficult situation. It kind of evolved that way. I didn't lead from the front. I kind of got nominated, pushed at the ranks, I think. As things became more uncomfortable, the social work role got increased. Angela says, which is interesting, isn't it? The more polarised these various players became, there needed to be somebody that held it together, because there is one person that it all had to be held together for. So do you think if you were talking to other members of the staff, they would recognise that that's what happened here? Yes, I know that people were thankful that somebody, I guess, lessened the tension and made it manageable. Angela, and did Elizabeth die in hospital? She did. Yeah, there was no fantastic resolution, but it was manageable. She got married here. A lot of staff went to the wedding. I actually popped in just quickly. I didn't stay, but I popped in. Yes, it was a very involved case. The ward staff were very involved. I wasn't as involved as they were. And you know, I remember the OT, who was somebody who kept a distance, an emotional distance from patients. And that was her way of coping with the work that we do. She was in tears and had to run away one day. It was one of those cases. I felt it, but in a different way. Angela, if we were now to look at the knowledge and skills that you were using in that case, how would you name them? I'd certainly say counselling skills, family therapy skills. I'm quite influenced by systemic family therapy, so I wasn't just going to knock the parents out of the picture. An idea about setting ground rules, I think that probably comes from family therapy as well, but certainly a clarity about that. The ability to take yourself out of the situation and reflect rather than react. That has to be an important part of that case. Angela, it was huge because you could see what was happening to people who were simply becoming caught up with it. That's right, and some people got emotional, some people became friends. The consultant involved in the case became very clinical, so we all positioned ourselves in different ways. To deal with what was going to be a very difficult case, says Angela. She was a very beautiful woman as well before she became horribly disfigured in her face. I think it all added to it for people. So Angela says, so in terms of where you're drawing your knowledge from and the sort of skills you're using, we're getting a sense of what you know as a counsellor about your drawing from family therapy, particularly from systemic family therapy. Could you name me other skills that you think you were using here? I think we could probably map them out quite nicely against what you're doing. Again, some resonance with you, Jim, mapping. And the answer, I think there was an awful lot of holding of emotions. I was doing an awful lot of holding people's emotions. I'm pretty good at confidentiality and what I didn't do. That happens a lot in hospitals. And in this case, I was pretty clear I didn't do it. I didn't talk about what other people had said to me about this. I listened to anybody who spoke to me. I spoke about some of my feelings, but I didn't say, oh yes, so-and-so said this. I just didn't go there. Presumably you selected which feelings you were going to talk about. Yes, very clearly, and only if it helped the interaction. I was just aware it could become a quagmire. Angela, and feeding what was already a very intense situation. Absolutely, and just wanting to decrease the high expressed emotions, for want of a better word. There was a lot of high expressed emotions around, and that could have had a life of its own. Particularly in a very tight-knit hospital community, which this is. People work here for a long time, and you need to be aware of that, and you need to be aware that even if you're not on the ward, you could be talking to somebody who knows somebody who works on the ward, so best to say nothing. Now, while you were doing this, you were engaging groups of staff, groups of family members, and maintaining your own position and relationship in there. Was there at any stage a time when you thought you needed other knowledge or other skills? Answer: yes, certainly, especially around the legal aspects of the case. So the law in relation to childcare, legal issues there, and certainly I rang up for advice. And looking in terms of medical information that I get is very high quality, and I work with a small team, and we're very tightly knit, and I have access to consultants very readily, and they will listen to social workers. A good relationship then, says Angela. Absolutely. There's no tension in between the medical team and myself. Advocacy skills were very important too, because there is that, this is the illness, this is what it means. Talking about, you can get everything down to the facts. But when it came down to the decision of when to tell Elizabeth she was dying, the point around that was there were things Elizabeth wanted to do, and there were things like get married, and she had unrealistic ideas of how much time she had and what she wanted to do. And my point was to talk to the doctors about, well, you need to be realistic. If you think she's going, she's got to know. It was almost too hard to tell her, and I said, that's not fair, she needs to know. And then it becomes a question of when do we tell her? Well, I think we should tell her now. Unfortunately, again, that became, we decided to have a meeting with her and her partner to tell them about it. I was asked to arrange the meeting. I spoke to Elizabeth and she said, why am I having a meeting? Are they going to tell me that I'm dying? She asked me first, and I had to say, well, I felt that she deserved honesty to say, yes, I think they're going to tell you that. So in fact, I even told her. Angela sort of preempted it in advance, and she was ready for the meeting. She was, and I think she asked the person she wanted to hear it from. I think it's about honesty too. When things get tough, be honest, and never going beyond the bounds of your professional role. But I could have said, oh, I don't know, but that would have been fetching it. Angela, but she knew she could rely on you for honesty. Answer, and consistency. I think that was part of it. I feel like I'm making myself out to be an angel here. And it was a very difficult case, and it was difficult, but I was lucky. I was experienced. I wasn't fresh out of college. So that makes a huge difference, says Angela. You weren't trying things out for the first time. That's it. And I think there's goodwill that I see in new workers that I recognise that I had, where you will, because something is emotive, try harder or go beyond your boundaries. And there's one thing I'm quite clear about, I won't do that, because I know I'll lose my effectiveness. So it's not one of not caring, but it's about protecting yourself and protecting the people around you. And talking like that was very useful for other staff to hear me talk like that, because it was often a question I was asked, how are you coping with this? It's about boundaries. When Elizabeth died, they organised a meeting on the ward for the staff to attend, a kind of debrief session with our employee assistance program. I was pretty much ordered to be there and to talk about my feelings. I couldn't just go, I was told to go and talk about my feelings. So I was kind of set up to model that. I guess I accepted that because that was my role throughout this. Angela, if you were describing the qualities a practitioner would need to deliver this service, how would you sum these up? Patience. I mean, I didn't run in there saying, I'll sort this situation out, leave it to me, get out of the way, it's the social worker coming. Consistency. Modelling emotional intelligence, for want of a better word. It's about that. And then very sound counselling skills. An ability to systematically view what goes from the family, the organisation, the whole thing. Just thinking about things systematically. Good facilitation skills in negotiation, effective emotional distance. I think that palliative care is one of those areas that draws you in slowly. And I personally, everybody has their own style in social work, which obviously people's personalities do influence how we work. I would say that it's an incredibly important thing to be aware of teamwork. Again, resonating with Jim. To understand the culture of your team, to work with that culture and find a way to be effective within that culture. Not just to come in with your own style, but to really, and I think social workers are good at this, to find your way of being effective within a team. Patience is an important part of it. I don't think we have to prove ourselves. I think sometimes people come into new teams and feel they have to prove their worth. And I know that social work as a profession is one where we feel we're not quite. I would say, don't worry about that. A bit like Colleen was talking about, in terms of getting all the referrals for psychologists and just...
educating the doctors.
Yes. I guess I do have a counselling background and the team know, so that there's that professional expertise that you have in the same way as the doctor has their expertise. And in terms of evidencing family therapy skills and things like that, I don't think you need to, because I think that sometimes it's good to refer back to your knowledge base, but sometimes people use their knowledge bases when they feel uncertain about their role, and you can actually lose people doing that. And in a clinical situation, it's more likely to be a new grad or someone who's unsure about themselves who'll say, well, in family therapy and systemic family therapy, it's really important to consider where the parents are and not knock their positions in relation to the family hierarchy. And I think I'd have lost a lot of people if I'd done that. If I was writing it up or using it as case history, then I certainly would have referred to the theories and used it as a teaching tool. Then yes. I keep my language simple, I don't justify what I'm doing unnecessarily, and when it comes to emotional issues, well, you work with them because they are emotional. Is it not going down? You've got the next one, have you? Just going back to Taylor and White, and reflecting on what she was talking about, social work is as much a practical moral activity as it is a technical rational one. There wasn't much technical rational to her dealing with those complexities. It's important to explore and debate the range of rationalities upon which social workers depend when they make their professional judgments. And they suggest that social workers, like all engaged practitioners, make knowledge. And it is knowledge that's context specific, but it's knowledge all the same. There was a lot of knowledge she had about the case of Elizabeth that was necessary to the outcomes she achieved. And in this, they often use narrative. And we all do. I'm sure you all talk narrative, given half a chance. Now, just to finish off, there was a second interview at the interviewee's specific request in order to clarify. She felt she might have left the wrong impression. And again, this is about the reflection that we bring into our practice. And on reflection, she wanted to say, this is my postscript. I was just thinking about, I don't want to portray a picture of palliative care social work that wasn't realistic. The cases I gave were two extreme cases that came up over a period of nearly 3 years that I've been doing the job. And my concern was that I didn't want it to appear that there was something special about palliative care and that we don't do evidence-based practice. I do evidence-based practice. And I guess That keeper of safe spaces was the one that worried me. Just worried me in the sense that I think it's an important part of what we do, but it is central to good counselling skills and ethical practice, and I guess the therapeutic relationship and building that. It is not something special about palliative care, and I just wanted to make it sort of clear it did stem from social work practice and ethical social work practice, and that for me in particular it is very important to work in a neutral way. I guess that is what I was worried about. Sometimes the emotion of that kind of work can take you away from it, and I just wanted to put that back in, just in case you got the wrong idea. These stories are very emotive stories, and that's it. It's not routinely what I do, but we were asked to think of ones where we were effective, and I knew that I had been. Of course, palliative care is emotive by the nature of the work. It is emotive work, but the essence of it is core social work values and operating from those values and being neutral. That was the stuff. I just thought I wanted to balance that. I want to balance it. My concern was, I guess, that balance between not having to justify social work as a profession, not having to do that, however, not wanting to be seen as a touchy-feely, squishy keeper of safe spaces and thereby dismissed as not dealing in hard facts, hard evidence. It was about where's the neutral language that can describe what we do in a way that makes us effective, and effective as a profession, and effective for our patients, our advocates who we are, and as advocates for who we're advocating for, I guess. So I wouldn't be describing my work in those terms. I don't want it to seem special at all, because it's not, and I want it to be grounded in theory, which it is. And I don't want it to seem overwhelming to a new graduate, because that kind of story can seem a bit overwhelming. When I thought about it afterwards, I thought about a new grad, and I'm saying, be patient, and they're probably running for cover. I wanted to bring back to the underlying professionalism that is behind what we do, and the difference between who we are as people and who we are as practitioners, because I think social work is one of those professions where there is an over. Writing that up into a paper that will be published in the near future, and Sabina and I will be part of that. But what we've concluded from this particular interview and the others, everybody we interviewed, they valued the reflective space the interview provided, that they found it therapeutic for themselves to be able to talk about practice in these terms. And when you looked at what they recorded on the hospital official documents, it was very thin indeed. And you would look and wonder, what nurse social workers do? What do they do? The narratives demonstrated use of reflective and evidence-based knowledge, and the interweaving of skills and evidence from social work theories, models, etc. And our next step in this project is to facilitate a discursive exchange between the researchers and practitioners about where we got to with this research, because we see it as a work in progress. And I want to finish by saying I hope others of you can join in actually researching our practice and articulating that across the range of knowledges, not just scientism. And that's all I've got for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fran. As it's nearing 12:30, again, I know there might... Is there any burning question you have of Fran? One.
Fran, you said that what they wrote in the social work notes, that's one of the issues we're having. I work at a council service. It would be interesting if that group could explore ways that woman could have expressed something of the depth of what she did in a sort of concise way. That's the dilemma, isn't it? How do you reflect the depth of what you're doing in there?
I think some of this goes back to Jim's point, because Jim used a lot of publications by psychologists because they're just not there for social work. We really need to get, because you could do a little sentence and then do a reference where this is written up in greater depth. Probably not always, but at least you have that to call on. But it's like, it seems like you have to keep reinventing the wheel and explain yourself from square one when these are shared parts of practice that we all know exist, but we have this continuing dilemma of having to justify ourselves. And
Fran, do you think? I mean, in that case study that you described in depth there, the consultant actually deferred to the social worker in a critical aspect of managing that case. Do you think that recognition of the importance of social work practice in very difficult cases, moral and ethical cases, and difficult, public health clients, do you think that is recognised in the broader medical field, or
not in publications? I think it's recognised in practice. I mean, it's quite widely evidenced, and in some research publications, doctors don't like death, by and large.
They don't like
death. They don't
Yes.
embrace working with death. I mean, a few do.
But I mean, it is around, both death and also all the other difficult cases that social workers deal with. The ones that don't fit into psychological categories and all the rest.
When things get difficult, they call the social worker in.
And do you think that is beginning to be recognised by the broader medical profession?
Well, when people have power, they very rarely give it away.
That's right.